Tomlinson. Welcome to another episode of Sunday Morning Live. Appreciate everybody that joins for these live and also by replay. So if you're watching live or watching by replay, be sure to comment and let me know. And we're going to have some fun in this episode. It is Palm Sunday 2026. We're coming up on Easter next Sunday. We're coming up on the Jewish Passover season. And I want to talk about those two things today and in this episode. This is a time, and I realize that for many years I was creating deconstruction content, and a lot of my followers have a bad taste in their mouth when it comes to scripture, Bible stories, anything Christianity. And I get it. Listen, I get it. Totally get it. In fact, I was reminded today of, I think it was Palm Sunday 2017, and I was in the midst of tremendous burnout, had been pastoring without really much of a break for many, many years, a vacation here and there, but that was about it. Putting in tons of hours every week, spending time with people, preparing messages, doing, what I thought I needed to do to be a good pastor. And then towards the end of 2016, suffered from major burnout. My mom got sick with cancer. We had been taking care of my father, who had passed away in 2015. Both my parents lived with us. My father was very ill. He had slow deteriorating lung disease. There was many 911 calls. There was many trips to the emergency room, many weeks, days and weeks spent together with my mom, nursing him back to health, only to see him crash again. And we went through this for a couple of years. I want to say about 3 years, just constant being on guard. There was a lot of emotional trauma that went with that. And ironically enough, my father would always crash, meaning his vitals would destabilize, his oxygen levels would go down, his heart rate would go up, and he was in a very acute situation. And this would happen about every 6 or 7 weeks. And it always happened on Sunday, which was really interesting to me. My dad was really faithful member of our church. He was always out and attending every function that he could. And so I don't know if, the one day a week that he really got out put too much strain on him. I suppose that's possible, but it always happened on a Sunday. And then ironically or incidentally, in May of 2015, he died on a Sunday. And so then I want to say the fall of 2016, late summer of 2016, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. She would spend a year going through cancer treatments and, taking care of her. And it was exhausting. That on top of the demands of ministry, being relatively new parents, my children were still small, and going through my own personal spiritual awakening. So the end of 2016 was a real crisis. And so we had the opportunity in 2017 to get away at this time of year. We left at the end of February. We went to Phoenix, Arizona, where we had some friends that were living. We rented a Verbo for 3 months, and we just rested and relaxed and tried to get renewed and rejuvenated. And I got involved in counseling and working on the trauma that I'd experienced, not just from all the medical stuff and the trauma that comes with taking care of people that you love that need your care and are sick, but also some childhood trauma. What shocked me, though, what really, really shocked me was that I had experienced a lot of religious trauma and did not realize it. And so as I'm talking about Palm Sunday, as I'm talking about Holy Week, as I'm talking about these stories, I want to connect this to the subconscious programming that we all experience in this life, whether we are religious or not, whether being in the faith or being part of a church or part of a faith community has ever been part of our lives or not, whether we were raised in it or came into it later. or whether we didn't experience that, there are other ways in which we are subconsciously programmed. And so I was working with a very talented therapist in Phoenix who was very gifted and very good at bringing up this subconscious content that was still governing and still affecting and in many ways still ruling my life. And what I did not realize was that in the depths of my being, in my nervous system, I was carrying the message of the church, specifically the message regarding how sinful I was, how morally corrupted my nature was. Not because my nature was morally corrupted, let me set that straight, but because that's the messaging that we receive. And I've been writing about this, if you've been following me at all on Substack, just got on Substack, kind of, I'd read and heard that Substack was a social media platform that wasn't ruled by algorithms, that people who subscribe actually see your content. And so I was interested in it, and I just kind of, set up an account and put some stuff out there. And so far that's gone really well. But if you've been following me on Substack, if you haven't been following me on Substack, you can sign up to follow me on Substack. I'm releasing content at least once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, and really been enjoying that, really been getting good engagement off of that. But I've been talking about this problem that we have in the church related to the messaging that there is something deeply flawed with our humanity, and that because of that, we are in need of grace, or we are in need of salvation. And that's very personal to me, because that programming, that shame-based programming, really got deeply embedded inside of me. And due to, all the stress and turmoil, my wife and I were, in that third decade of marriage. We passed our 20 year mark. And for a lot of people, that third year, for some people, the third year of marriage is tough. But for a lot of people, that third decade can be really trying and difficult. And you go through various different seasons in your marriage. And we were in a difficult season. And we were fighting quite a bit. And we go to Arizona, and I'm sitting there with my therapist, and we're working on issues around my childhood relationship with my father and some traumas that I had experienced with that, when suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, this fear, this nervous system dysregulation comes up in the therapy session. And this is the week before Palm Sunday, 2017. It comes up in this therapy session. And all of a sudden, I am seeing in my mind's eye this image of God, this image of the Almighty, this monarch who's sitting on a throne. And I don't remember all of it, but I remember she asks me, she says, I explained what I was experiencing, and I said, I'm seeing God sitting on a throne. And she says, is God looking at you with judgment? And I remember very distinctly my answer. I said, no, God is not looking at me with judgment. God is looking upon me with wrath. It's a very different thing, very different experience. And I remember she said, I want you to tell that image you're bullshit. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to cuss out the Almighty when I think he's in a good mood, much less when I feel like I'm before that judgment seat. I feel like I'm before that throne, and this being is looking down on me with wrath. And so I said, no, I can't do that. And so she said, well, then jump up, in your mind's eye, jump up and give that image of the Almighty a big sloppy kiss. And I thought, well, it's so funny how the mind works. I said to myself, well, the scripture does say, love the Lord thy God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So that's a loving act. So I can do that. So I did that in my mind. And the moment I did that, the most amazing thing happened, because that image collapsed, completely collapsed in my mind. But what struck me was the immediate calming effect that dispelling that image had on my own nervous system. The only best way I could describe it was like there were these loud engines making noise in my mind and in my head that had been there for so long that I had forgotten that they were there. I just had come to live it with that internal noise. We call it trauma noise. I was living with it for so long that I wasn't paying attention to it, even though it was always there. It's not that much different than someone, say, who moves, let's say, to a big city like New York or Chicago, and there's subways, or there's the L. Let's say your apartment is there, and you got the street noise and the cars, and you've got the public transit, and so there's this constant hum of noise in the background. And if you take someone out of, say, like where I live, where it's really peaceful and quiet, or someone who lives in the country, or someone who lives in the mountains where they're isolated from that kind of noise, and you put them in that environment for a couple nights, they can't sleep. The noise is driving them crazy. But people that live in the city, they, even though they live with the noise, they don't realize that the noise is there. And that's what the trauma noise in my own head was like. And I remember all of that shut down and all of that went offline. And I could not believe how much better I felt out of that one session. That was the first thing that I couldn't believe. The second thing that was amazing was how peaceful things became with my marriage. See, if you're constantly in turmoil, if you're constantly on edge, if you're constantly hyper vigilant and scanning your environment for threats and don't realize it because you're living in a state of chronic stress and you've lived there so long, you're like the person who lives in the city and doesn't notice all the noise that's going on in your own head. Or maybe you are aware of all the noise that's going on in your head and you just can't seem to shut it off. Maybe you are aware that you're constantly dysregulated in your nervous system and constantly on guard, and you don't know why you're constantly on guard. Then you can relate to the experience that I was having, that I was living with. And when you're in that heightened state, you're going to be on edge all the time. You're going to be irritable. You're going to develop patterns in your life of fight or flight that don't necessarily show up as a clenched fist and don't show up as running away from a threat, but it shows up as aggression in your language. It shows up as road rage. It shows up as constant frustration with whatever the other group is out there, whether it's you're religious and you're worried about the other group that doesn't believe your religious doctrines, or you are very politically oriented to one side or the other, and you're angry at the other side because they just don't get it. You're angry at one side because you think they're sheep, and then the other side thinks you're sheep, and all of that stuff. But you're living in a constant state of irritability, and so the aggression comes out in your language. The aggression comes out in passive aggressive sort of ways. It might come out on Facebook posts or Facebook comments or response to comments that you get. Whatever it is, those are examples of the fight mechanism always being on. And when that fight mechanism is always being on, it's impossible to build and develop healthy, whole, meaningful, fruitful, abundant relationships. Now, the flight side of that can look a different way. The flight side of that can look like avoiding situations, avoiding people. You walk in the supermarket, you see someone you don't want to see, and for whatever reason you can't even explain, it could even be a friend, it could be a coworker, but you just don't want to talk to them, and so you take a different aisle or a different path so that you don't run into them. Or it could take the form of procrastination, things that that you want to get done, maybe even things that you're motivated to get done, but you're constantly putting those things off, constantly avoiding those things. These are ways that fight or flight shows up for us living in this world in the 21st century. And so What I didn't realize was that with all that trauma noise and with all that stuff that was affecting and impacting my nervous system, that I was creating a lot of the strife and a lot of the problems that were happening, not just in my marriage, but in the ministry, almost everywhere that I was in life. What I did not know was the cause of it. If you'd had asked me before that therapy session why I was the way I was in terms of being on edge, being irritable, being anxious, I would have probably said it was related to trauma, and I would have related it, like most of us probably do, to childhood traumas. I would have related it to things that I experienced that were very traumatic for me when I was coming of age as a teenager, from about 16 to about 19. When in reality, what was keeping my being in this hyperactive, hyper alert, nervous state was the belief, the uncertainty, if you will, that I was right with God, that I was being a good person, that I was doing a good enough job, that I was following the plan and the program that had been given to me well enough. And the moment in therapy we got to the root of that religious trauma and resolved it in a moment, all of that shut down. All of that went away. And this is prior to Palm Sunday 2017. So Monday was when I had my appointments. So the rest of the day on Monday, I'm peaceful, I'm calm, I'm happy, I'm more loving. It's almost like the fruit of the Spirit, everything we wanted, if you know what I mean by that. The list in Galatians 5, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all that stuff was just kind of naturally there. I wasn't having to fake it, I wasn't having to put it on. And Tuesday, same thing. By Wednesday, I'm like, my life is so different. I feel so different. And here's what I can't believe. I cannot believe that what I thought was the medicine was really the poison. What I thought was helping me in my life, and to some degree it did. And what I'm talking about is my religious faith, the thing that I'd been dedicated to for decades. I can't believe that that was the root of the problem. It wasn't my relationship with my father. I'd worked through that. It wasn't the trauma that had happened to me when I was younger. Up to that point in my life, I'd worked through enough of that wasn't the issue. What was really the issue was the way that I believed that I fit into the scheme of things in life, because I had a view of a wrathful, vengeful, judging God, monarch in the sky that was getting ready to bring the hammer down on me at any moment. And I just couldn't believe that what I thought was the antidote, what I thought was the medicine, was actually what had been making me sick. And so everything's peaceful, everything's good, we're getting along. Sunday comes, it's Palm Sunday. We're like, it's Palm Sunday, we probably should go to church. We packed up the kids, we found a local church there. We went and sat through the service. There was nothing, there was no hellfire preaching, there was no angry God presented. They were presenting a grace message, which, by the way, I had been a grace preacher up until that time for about 20 years. I had told other people, God's not mad at you. I had told other people that your sins are forgiven, that you are the righteousness of God in Christ, that you are a new creation, all of that stuff that we believed and accepted and taught back then. I believed it in my head. I believed it in my mind. I was saying the right things. I was preaching the right doctrines as far as that goes. I don't think I preached, maybe I preached one or two sermons in 30 years about hell, but most of the time my faith, my inspiration was in the fact that I believe that a relationship with Christ brings healing. I believe it brings abundance. I believe that it brings provision, protection, all these wonderful things. And so I focused most of my emphasis in my own daily walk, as we call it, with the Lord, and in my preaching on all those various different things, all those concepts, all that positive stuff. And that's what we were hearing. We were hearing all that stuff. And we walk out, and by the time we get lunch ready back at the house that we had rented, I'm being irritable again. We're snapping. My wife and I are snapping at each other again. I'm back in that same mode of expression without realizing it, without catching it. And what I realized was that So much of what was traumatic for me about the faith had been so deeply programmed inside of me. It had been so rooted in my body, so rooted in my nervous system, that simply going to church and even hearing a happy message or opening my Bible or hearing the name Jesus or talking about Palm Sunday was triggering that program in my nervous system. And so I'm saying all that to say that I understand when people have experienced religious trauma, when people have deconstructed from a faith that was more poisonous for them than healing, that was toxic for them, if they've experienced a lot of spiritual abuse, then they are naturally angry. For some people, it's just part of the grieving process. For some people, there's just an anger there, which is also part of the fight or flight. And they've identified the threat as being the teachings or the doctrines or the faith itself or the people who are, loyal to that faith, whatever the case may be. And so I understand, if people pass on the content or get upset, why is he talking about Palm Sunday, etc., and so on. But if you're still with me, and if you can identify yourself in some of that stuff, sometimes it's helpful to simply reframe what certain things mean. So that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. I want to talk about Passover. Millions of Jewish people will be celebrating Passover this week. Millions of Christians are celebrating this week as Holy Week, the time when Jesus, Palm Sunday, commemorates or marks or holds this day sacred because it represents and helps us remember the time when in the gospel stories Jesus goes into Jerusalem. He goes in riding on a donkey. People take palm branches and they lay palm branches on the ground, and they make the declaration of him as their king. They say, Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And it was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. And then by Thursday, as the progression of Holy Week is traditionally held, by Thursday, everyone in the city rejects him. The Jewish leaders and the Romans conspire to have him captured and crucified, which they accomplish on Friday. We call it Good Friday. And he dies on the cross for our sins, the Lamb of God slain, John's gospel says, on Friday, and then is resurrected on Easter Sunday, which we will celebrate next week. For Jewish people, the Passover represents the story of Moses and how their ancestors, called the children of Israel in the book of Exodus, were made to be slaves in Egypt, and their lives were made hard with bondage and labor and all the stuff that goes with slavery. And God meets with Moses in the burning bush, and God sends Moses back to Pharaoh, and Moses tells Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, you got to be crazy. I'm not going to lose my workforce. I'm not going to let them go. So Moses brings a series of plagues. It's an interesting story, right? There's a plague of darkness. The Nile is turned, the water's turned from water into blood. You've got frogs. You've got a plague of frogs. You got a plague of locusts. You got frogs in the oven. Can you imagine just the whole land being so overridden, so invaded by a species of frogs that you go to bake your Sunday pie or whatever, and you open up the oven and there's frogs jumping out of the oven. That's kind of the picture that the Bible paints. And each time the plague would come, Pharaoh would promise to release the children of Israel if Moses would remove the plague. And so Moses would remove the plague, and then Pharaoh would change his mind until finally the Passover, when I guess God really meant business, or Moses really meant business. And he said, okay, here's what's going to happen. The angel of death is going to pass over. This is where we get the term Egypt and is going to kill the firstborn of everything that lives. Now, that's significant with where I'm going in the story and how I understand the story. He's going to kill the firstborn, including the firstborn in every family. But the Jewish people, the Israelites, could be protected by killing a firstborn lamb and taking that blood and placing it on their door. And the angel of death, when it sees the blood of the lamb, will pass over your house, and your firstborn will not die. Your firstborn will live. Everybody else in Egypt that doesn't have the blood on their doorposts, the firstborn of all their cattle, all their sheep, the firstborn pets, but cats that they had. Cats were popular, or were not popular. Cats were sacred in Egypt. And the firstborn human. It's kind of a bloody, yucky story. And so this happens. They killed a lamb. The Israelites killed a lamb. They put the blood on the doorposts. The angel passes over them. Pharaoh is so distraught at the death of his firstborn son that he finally does decide to give the children of Israel their freedom, to set them free from their bonds, to set them free from their slavery. And Moses leads them on this trek through the wilderness, and eventually they make it in the next generation through Joshua into the land of Canaan, which was their promised land. And so historically, the Passover is sacred to Jews and Christians. And then historically, the account of Jesus going into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and then, of course, crucifixion on Friday night and resurrection on Sunday, is sacred to Christians. And both describe salvation events or deliverance events. For the Passover, it's deliverance from literal slavery, literal bondage. For Christians, it's liberation from the power of sin for most people in the Latin stream of the West, which includes Roman Catholicism and all the Protestant churches and all the evangelical churches and all the Pentecostal churches. For the Eastern churches, the more Oriental churches, they're called. So this includes the Church of Syria, Turkey, as well as Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. They don't see it so much as a liberation from sin in the same way that we see it in the West. They see it as a liberation from separation from the divine, the inability to participate in the divine nature, but also as liberation from death. That Jesus, in his resurrection, broke the powers of death, took the keys of death, hell, and the grave, and set all of humanity free from the power of death. And so that's the literal historical interpretation. That's what we might call the exoteric meaning of the text. But I want to suggest to you that there is something more going on in both of these stories, and that they have similarities, and that they are archetypal in the most Jungian sense ever, meaning that these are principles, these are ordering and governing primary principles in the collective unconscious, especially and maybe only of people in the West, that speak to the liberation of the self, the liberation of the self, the liberation of the authentic self, the liberation of the true self. And like every great story and every great myth, they speak to us at a very deep psychological, subconscious, and unconscious level that can be very powerful and very liberating. And the term exoteric, as I'm using it, means to those who are outside, or it deals with the external realities. It deals with the public. Jesus was an exoteric and esoteric teacher in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. It says that he taught the multitudes in parables. He taught them in stories. He taught them in myth. He taught them with archetypes. He was speaking to them at a very deep level, at a level that, in some sense, bypasses the conscious mind to speak to the depths of our being, to cause something to speak to our spiritual potential, Joseph Campbell says, to cause something to become awakened within us. This archetypal, parabolic, mythic language that isn't taken literally, isn't meant to be taken literally. That's the exoteric. And then when the multitudes would leave, Jesus' disciples would come to him and say, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And give us the meaning. And then Jesus would reveal the inside meaning of the parable. Here's how the parable relates to the kingdom of God. Here's how the parable relates to your spiritual growth and your spiritual transformation. So exoteric means those that are outside. It refers both to the people, but it also refers to the literal historical understanding of the story, the myth, or the text. And esoteric refers to that which is inward. So it refers to the inner circle, the initiates, the disciples, those that are given the secret meanings and the secret interpretations. That's what the word esoteric means, but it also refers to inward transformation. Something that's happening, not something that happened to you outside or something that necessarily happened literally and historically, but something that's happening in you that is releasing you from something, that is liberating you from something, that is empowering you and empowering your spiritual potential in some way. And so, whether we like it or not, religious trauma aside, whether we like it or not, in the Western world, our primary spiritual myth, in the sense, and I don't want to offend my Christian audience, I'm not saying it's a myth in the sense that these things don't have a historical precedent, or that they didn't have, that Jesus wasn't a historical person, or that the crucifixion or resurrection didn't happen. I'm not saying that. Or to my Jewish friends, I'm not saying that there was no Exodus, even though the historical and archaeological evidence seems to indicate that there wasn't. We both have the same problem. Christians don't have solid historical evidence for the crucifixion and for the resurrection. There wasn't even agreement about the resurrection in the early church when you go back and examine the doctrines. But what I'm saying is that there's a deeper level, there's an internal meaning, there's a esoteric, if you will, interpretation. There's a way that these stories, as they are told and as we read them, that they speak to us. And that has been so embedded in the Western psyche that it applies to all of us. It can speak very powerfully to us. It is the primary spiritual myth of the Western world. And so, whether we embrace the faith ever, whether we deconstructed from the faith, whether, like me, we had religious trauma associated with these stories, it does not change the fact that these stories are living in our collective unconscious and have tremendous power for bringing about wholeness and freedom and empowerment to our genuine, deepest self. And that's how I want to look at these stories. Let me start with the Christian version, because most of my audience is probably Christian or deconstructed Christian, or at least aware of the rhythms of Palm Sunday and Holy Week and Easter. So here's how the story goes. It's very interesting. Here's the traditional understanding of the story. Jesus comes in to Jerusalem, finally, on Palm Sunday. And like I said, he rides a donkey. And as he's riding on a donkey, the people in Jerusalem are honoring him and recognizing him as their Messiah. Blessed is Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And they're laying palm branches on the ground. And he's very received. And in the story, the next thing that he does is he goes into the temple. Now, the temple was a very active time during Passover. This was also obviously during Passover. And the temple was a very active time because people would travel. They were commanded in the book of Deuteronomy to make a journey, to make a trip, to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast, so that the whole nation would be celebrating it together. And it would be, and the temple was the center of political and spiritual life in first century Jerusalem for the first century Jews. And it would be inconvenient to bring your own lamb. And so they would set up a marketplace in the temple, and they would sell the sacrifices to the people who had made the journey, who had made the pilgrimage. And there was apparently other types of marketing and exchange for money and selling that was going on in the temple. And Jesus surveys the temple. In one of the gospel stories, he goes in and he surveys the temple, and he becomes enraged. And he famously says, "You've taken my father's house and you have turned it into a den of thieves." And he fashions a whip. He overturns the table of the money changers. He drives everyone, including the animals, out of the temple. And then he also makes a series of statements exposing the hypocrisy of the religious teachers of the day and speaking truth to power. And so the way the story goes, this enrages the religious leaders, it enrages the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It upsets the Roman government, and so they conspire together with one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, who is Judas, to have Jesus arrested. And then something really interesting happens. Jesus goes, in one of the gospel accounts, I think it's John's account, he goes before Pilate, and he and Pilate have this deep philosophical discussion. And Pilate's wife comes to him and says she had a dream, and that she was troubled in this dream, and that Pilate is not to have this man executed. So he brings Jesus before a group of people. It's debatable whether it was a crowd like we see in the movies that were made, or whether it was a small group of religious leaders. But he brings the people, whether it was the religious leaders or whether it was the broader crowd in Jerusalem of that day, whether it was the same people that had received Jesus as their Messiah on Palm Sunday or not, he brings a murderer, a rebel named Barabbas, and they get to choose between, do they want Jesus or do they want Barabbas? And the crowd chooses Barabbas, and so they release Barabbas, and then Pilate proceeds to have Jesus crucified. And in John's gospel, Jesus is crucified the day before the Passover, on the day of preparation. When the Passover lamb is being slaughtered, Jesus is dying on the cross. That's the way John presents it. In what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples and then is arrested. So we have a discrepancy in the time frame there. But setting that aside, it's typically understood that it was Jesus' actions by cleansing the temple and condemning the temple system that enraged the people and caused him to be crucified. And then, of course, on Sunday, Easter Sunday, he rises from the dead. I want to present this in a more archetypal manner. And here's what I want to suggest. Two interesting features, really, about Palm Sunday that I want to highlight that connect to you and your authentic self, your healing, your deliverance, if you will, from something that you probably didn't even realize was holding you in bondage, though you probably recognize it in yourself as I talk about it. They take tree branches, something that's growing native to the region, palm trees, native to the region. They take the branches from the trees and they lay them on the ground as sort of a processional as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, as he's coming into headquarters. And he's riding, I mentioned earlier, he's riding on a donkey. And Mark's gospel specifically tells us that it was a donkey upon which no man had ever sat. It was a wild donkey. So we have a wild donkey that has not been domesticated, and we have a wild tree, a native tree, whose branches are so significant to us on the archetypal level that we still call it Palm Sunday today, 2,000 years later. Give me 1 second. I just saw that my computer is about to die and I don't want to have that happen. So give me 1 second. Okay. So the wild tree is part of this story. A wild donkey upon whom no man has sat is part of the story. And Christ coming in and being recognized and being honored, going into the headquarters, going into the capital city, represents or can represent. There's many different ways to look at this. I'm not saying this is the authoritative interpretation, but I'm saying the way we can look at this is that it can represent for us our native, wild, natural self. What do you mean by that, Aaron? If you've been following my teachings the last few weeks, I've been talking about this essence of who we are that was placed inside of us as we were being formed in the mother's womb. That our bodies really are a temple for the divine. The divine that it carries is the essence of our being, of our soul. And this body is the earthen vessel that our natural, native, wild self is woven into, is built into. It's built into the body. The essence, if you go back and watch the teachings, in the Hebrew, it's called the golem. In the Greek Septuagint, the word is hypostasis. Both of them represent unformed potential and essence. Who you naturally are, who you were born to be. And when you express who you were born to be, when you express your native self, there are days ordained for you in your life, and life begins to open up for you in a way that's not a struggle anymore. Life begins to open up for you in a way that it meets you and it greets you, because it's meeting and greeting your authentic, natural, native self. The you, the essence, the soul, the divine spark, the spiritual essence of who you are, that naturally knows how to be, that naturally knows how to live in this world. And I think that's what part of what's being represented here. I think that's part of what the donkey represents. I think that's what the palm trees represent, the palm branches, if you will, represent. And so Jesus shows up as the authentic self from this perspective. The you that is you, before you were told that you were wrong, before you were told how to conform and how the world works and how you're supposed to be and how you should be, before all that pressure was placed upon you, before anyone met you in a way that they weren't there for you. In other words, we come into this world so alive, so vibrant, so spontaneous, so innocent. We come into this world expressing who we are, and we find that those expressions at times are celebrated, and at times those expressions aren't met. A child comes in from outside playing and brings in some creature. It could be a frog, like I mentioned earlier. In my case, it was usually snakes, and I don't like snakes. And the child comes in with joy at what they've discovered, with just the fun and the excitement of it. And you're on the phone. It's important. The business that you're taking care of, whatever that phone call is, it's important, but you're distracted. And they come in with all this joy, and you just kind of nod, or you tell them, take that outside. And it leaves the child confused. I'm so excited. I'm so alive. This is so wonderful. Look at this. What do you mean? And so All of us experience that, right? All of us did that to our kids. There's no condemnation or guilt or shame that you should feel about that. That's just the way life is in this world. And our children need to know that they're not going to be celebrated by everyone, and that not every expression of their native self is socially appropriate for the context. But it's different to teach someone how to navigate as their natural self in social environments in appropriate ways versus a rejection and a shame message that gets layered over and over and over on top of that natural self, on top of that wild self, until we become shut down and we begin to live out of a different self. We begin to live out of what I'm calling the managed self. What is the managed self? The managed self is the self that we can use the analogy, we can use the parable of a tree, that you were planted as a wild tree in this garden of this world, and you know exactly what kind of fruit you're supposed to bring forth. You know exactly what your leaves are supposed to be, and you know exactly the rhythms and the timings of your own life. You know this from within. You know it in the same way that a bird knows how to fly south for the winter. You know it in the same way that a penguin knows, or a salmon knows when to swim upstream, or a penguin knows who they've mated with for life. Like they can distinguish somehow which one of these birds that are so, the same in their appearance, and they know which one's theirs and which one isn't. It's just innate to them. The bird knows to fly south. The salmon knows to swim upstream. Why would everything in nature have that innate expression and intelligence to guide them and to show them who they are and how they should be expressing themselves in their lives? But somehow we as human beings go through identity crisis. Somehow we as human beings don't seem to know the times or the seasons of our life. We don't seem to know what our purpose is. For some of us, we don't even know what we're feeling anymore. Some of us are afraid to desire anymore because we've been so hurt in life. We've been so disappointed in life. We've been so let down in life that we just shut off the desiring part. We shut down the wanting part. And so what happens to most of us is that this natural self that we are, this essence, this golem that I've been talking about, this hypostasis, this pure potential that wants to express itself, receives a messaging from the world that says, no, the native self is not acceptable. You have to manage yourself. You have to construct a self. And so we create a managed self. It happens to us with our parents and our families, but it also happens to us. Boy, does it happen to us in religion. And this is what I realized in 2016, that I had been living a managed version of myself rather than an authentic version of myself. Because I believed that I was rotten to the core, because I believed that I was deserving of the wrath of God, not because of what I did, but because of who I was, because I was born to a fallen race, because I was born in sin. And so we develop this self that is carefully curated, that is carefully managed, and that is presented in public. And anytime we deviate from the managed self, there is a accuser that comes along inside of us and says, you're not enough. Something's wrong with you. What's wrong with you? Are you an idiot? Are you stupid? And we can become awashed with feelings of shame. And so we want to hide. We don't want to be seen. We have social anxiety. We have fear about speaking our mind, sharing our opinion. There's not the spontaneity in life anymore. There's not the waking up and greeting life as an adventure and wondering what's going to happen today, because we've so carefully managed the self that we are, that we've become in the habit of being and reproducing that self every day of our lives. All the while, the wild self, the native self, the authentic self, the original self, the Christ riding in on a wild donkey has gone offline for us and is laying dormant or is laying suppressed. And so we know that something's wrong. We just don't know what it is. So like me, some of us go to therapy, and therapy can be good. For me, therapy was good. It helped me find the authentic self. It helped me realize I've been living this managed version, carefully curated, managed version of myself to make sure that I'm a good Christian, a good husband, a good father, a good pastor, et cetera, and so on, to make sure I'm following the checklist and I'm presenting that the way I'm supposed to be presenting that. For other people, it's being whatever version of their career that they think they're supposed to be. It's all the roles that we play, whatever it means to be a good mom, whatever it means to be a good dad, good brother, good sister, good son or daughter, trying to always be the good girl, trying to always be the good boy. Carl Jung said that there comes a point, he didn't say it exactly like this, but I'm paraphrasing, there comes a point where you have to choose between being whole, living as an authentic expression of yourself, or being good. And so we get all this good, bad messaging. So religion does it to us. School does it to us. We get marks in school. We get classified. We have the honors kids. We have the AP classes. We have the remedial kids over here. We're all trying to homogenize them and grade them by one specific standard in school because we're using an education system that was developed by people like the Rockefellers in order to perpetuate the labor class and the working class. That's why there's bells in school. That's why there's a principal. That's why, you're given homework. The goal isn't to educate you in a way that helps you find your level of intelligence, wherever that may be. The goal is to conform you to a specific pattern, to make sure you can follow instructions, to make sure that you can be obedient, to make sure that you can be on time, to make sure that you show up, because we're developing a labor force. And the whole system is completely antiquated. And we're measuring everybody by the same standards, which makes absolutely no sense in the technological age in which we live. I can have a calculator do all the math for me that I need it to do. I can know the 50, if I want to know what the capital of the state of Maine is, I can type it into my phone and find out instantly. If I need to know the Gettysburg Address, it's right there in my pocket. But we're still educating in the same ways. When was the last time you had to diagram a sentence? How is that practical for life? I'm getting off on another one of my real soapboxes, but see, here's the thing. So then people start to measure themselves. I'm not intelligent. I'm not as smart as the other kids. Oh, I'm really intelligent. I'm a high achiever. And so we get our identity out of being a high achiever, or we get our identity out of being a low achiever. One's not better than the other. Both are a trap because both represent the system managing the self. The gardener's coming in, if you will, and tending to the garden and telling the garden what it's supposed to be, instead of letting the garden grow wild. Everyone is intelligent. There's just different levels of intelligence. And we know this. We've known this for decades. We've known that a person can have athletic intelligence, that they have a level of intelligence about how their body moves in space. And they have this tremendous power to coordinate their body through trillions of synaptic connections in the brain. Just walking requires a tremendous amount of brain power. And someone who's able to perform well in a physical activity has a level of intelligence that is incredible and could be developed. And they should spend their time there. Some people have spatial intelligence. Both of my kids have incredible spatial intelligence. What I mean by spatial intelligence is that they can solve those puzzle boxes. Like, we couldn't find a puzzle box difficult enough to give to our children on Christmas morning. We could get the highest level puzzle box that we could find, and they'd have that sucker open in 5-10 minutes. I mean, it'd be awesome in an escape room, right? The ability to fix things, MacGyver-like. Some of you know what I mean when I say MacGyver. One of my kids is just MacGyver, can just figure out what's wrong with stuff and fix stuff. And so that's a level of intelligence. Maybe lacking in some reading areas because one of my children is dyslexic. And so he's struggling with, am I smart? No, you have this incredible intelligence, but no opportunity to develop that in school. None. So you get the point. Some people have emotional intelligence. Some people have social intelligence. Some people have IQ intelligence. Some people have verbal intelligence. Some have intelligence with numbers. They just make sense. Some of them have musical intelligence. There's so many levels of intelligence when we step outside of this crazy system that we call public education, or just education in general. I am not for charter schools and private schools and all that other stuff. I'm for people to have options and stuff, but the whole thing needs to be shit canned, and we need to start over. if we want to build a society for the 21st century, because like it or not, AIs and all this other stuff, technology is coming for jobs anyway. We don't even know what we're preparing. I worked at a university. We don't even know what jobs we're preparing people for in the future because we don't know what jobs are going to be available to them. And the whole thing needs to be rethought. It needs to be completely revolutionized. And my point is that we developed a managed self and we measured ourselves based on what we were taught in school. So parents come in as gardeners, if you will, and tend the garden and tell us how we're supposed to grow and what we're supposed to look like. Schools come in and tell us how we're supposed to grow and what we're supposed to look like and what's intelligent and what's not intelligent and what is capable and what is not capability. And then we have the culture at large. We have the political spectrum, what it means to be a patriotic American, what it means to love America, what it means to love your country. How you show up in that way has to check the boxes. If you're part of our political party, you have to believe these things and you can't stray. You have to check every box. Otherwise, you might be one of the other. You might be one of them. You might be one of the enemies. So we become programmed in those ways. Social media. How many likes do you have? How many follows? How many views? Are you monetized yet? If you're monetized, how much money are you making? Homogenized, right? Homogenized Facebook posts, homogenized, well-crafted, well-curated videos. All of these things can cause us to step into the managed self. And then we think there's something wrong with me, so the managed self goes to therapy. And in my case, therapy helped me find my native self, but that's not the case for everybody. Sometimes they just get better ways to manage the managed self. Or we go into the self-help industry. And the self-help industry is built on you need help. It's not that much different than the industry of religion that says you need salvation. It's just a different kind of salvation. And so I try to figure out what are the 7 steps of highly effective people? How do I win friends and influence people? How do I bring my life or my corporation past the tipping point? How do I start with my why? All of that stuff, right, can just be more managed self. And we can end up living robotically. We can end up living dissatisfied. We hate our job, but we give most of our time to our job because that's where our money comes from. We're stuck in relationships that aren't working for us, whatever the case may be, because they're not natural to us. They're not native to us because the native self has gone offline. There's nothing wrong with the native self. Actually, the native self doesn't really need self-help, probably. And the native self doesn't really need therapy. The native self has just gone offline. The native self has been suppressed and with shame and guilt and all of this stuff. And I'm not smart enough and I got to trust the experts and all this stuff. Okay, I'm beating a dead horse. I'm beating a dead donkey, if you will. But this is what I think is happening on Palm Sunday. This is the archetypal pattern. The wild tree branches, the wild donkey, the true self riding into the capital, the true self going into the temple. Remember, I said that all of us, our body is a temple that hosts the divine. This is why in the East they say namaste. The divine in me recognizes the divine in you, and I bow. But you were told the temple had to hold something else, had to hold someone else. If you came up in the church, if you came up in the charismatic movement, it has to hold Jesus, it has to hold Christ, it has to hold the Holy Spirit. No, you are a Holy Spirit. Your native self is holy, and it has you're living out your natural life, and native life is your birthright for every single one of us. But there's a merchandised system. There's a managed self system that exists in the temple. There are thieves and robbers in there. There's the thief of negative self-talk. There's the robber of shame. There's the thief of unresolved trauma. All of this stuff that is stealing from us and violating us and still controlling our lives. And when the true self shows up, anger comes out. And Christ, representing that natural native self, throws him out of the temple. So why was Jesus rejected? Why was Jesus crucified from this perspective? Because it's a picture of the native self going into the managed self system, the powers that formed the managed self. And they say, no, we can't have the native self. We have to reject the native self. We have to betray the native self. These are all inner movements. If I violate my values to please someone else, I've betrayed myself. If I didn't set a boundary and did something I didn't want to do, maybe I've betrayed myself, like Judas betrayed Christ. And so the natural self gets rejected. The natural self gets hung on a tree. Scripture says, a cross, a wooden cross, crucified. So the system says we can't handle this. We can't handle this wild self. We have to get it under control. We have to eradicate it. It's a threat. And once crucified, the natural self goes offline. The natural self gets buried. The native self gets buried under the managed self. And so the message of Easter is, because it is your essence, because it existed before you were formed in your mother's womb, because your native self is your eternal self, not subject to birth or death, never subject to death, eternal, never subject to the wrath of God or this judgment seat that we've been told. And so the message of Easter is that the natural self will rise. So in John's gospel, Mary encounters Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, in a garden where things grow, where things are cultivated. And so what does this mean for us? What I've discovered is that we don't need near as much therapy. We don't need nearly all the self-help programs and the next book and the next conference, the next retreat. Those things are all good. They're all good. You know, I'm not saying don't read books or don't go on retreats. I'm not saying that at all. Just discern between what's the managed self and what's the natural self. They say, Aaron, well, how do I do that? Well, this brings me to the promotional part. I'm coming out with a book next month called Let the Wild Tree Grow. And for 12 chapters, I talk about this whole process, about how you discover the native self, bring the native self back online, find your true will and your true people, and then live that out in your daily life. It is something I'm very proud of. It wasn't a marketing idea that was given to me by a publishing company, although I hope it sells because I want to make the money, absolutely, but also because I think it's a message that needs to get out there. That you are that wild tree, that you can let that wild tree grow. And I talk about how the gardeners, the parents, the school, everything comes in and creates this managed self, and how to recognize the difference and how to live out of the true authentic self, the native self, the natural self. So I'll be doing some promotions for that book. I think the pre-order date is going to be like April 28th, I think is when it's coming out. But if you like my work, you want to support my work, I'm getting ready to launch some online programs. I'm getting ready to plan some retreats. I was going to do that this year. Some of you that are donors, you got a video email from me where I promised a lot of this stuff. And I know I've been talking about a lot of this stuff in the past as well. But life happens. And so I think I sent that out in January or something, and life happened. And we had some real family crisis that required my total undivided attention, so much so that I quit my job because of that. But there was an opportunity baked into that, because now I've got all this time to actually do the stuff that's been in my heart to do, that I've been saying that I'm going to do. So I have my book coming out. It is the byproduct of how I've lived my life. It's not just a message. Like I said, it wasn't given to me by a marketing company. It is in many ways a manifesto, if you will. But I think it'll really help people. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to comment. If you enjoyed today, if you didn't enjoy today, give me the feedback and let me know. And I'll be with you again. I'm planning on doing some teaching in the New Day Global group on Facebook. So if you haven't joined the New Day Global Facebook page, please do that. If you want to support our work, I'm unemployed now. I can use all the support and help that I can get. If this has helped you, if this has blessed you today, even if it's just a one-time gift, there's links in the description. You can go to paypal.me/New Day Global. On Cash App, it's the little money sign, Conscious Spiritual. That goes to New Day Ministries, which is our nonprofit organization. And both those donations go there, but that helps us produce and keep this kind of content going. Certainly, once the book is out, if you want to buy the book, join the New Day Global group, follow me on Substack, and I'll see you again for sure next week, if not before.